I was reviewing venue contracts for a Saturday client when I saw his name. Not on my screen by accident, not a coincidence of two men sharing a common name. Elliot Vance, groom, listed on a deposit agreement for the Ash Grove estate, dated 8 weeks from that afternoon. I run a boutique wedding planning firm. I have read thousands of these contracts. I know exactly what a real one looks like. Signed, notarized, deposit cleared. This one was real, and the bride's name printed beside his was not mine. I did not call him. I did not slam my laptop shut and drive to his office demanding an explanation. I forwarded the file to my own private folder, noted the venue coordinator's name, and closed the tab the way I close out any contract I've finished reviewing for the day. Then, I sat very still at my desk for a long time, hands folded, and I did not cry. My name is Camille Ashford. I am 34 years old, and for the last 9 years, I have built a career on exactly one skill: reading the fine print other people are too excited or too trusting to read themselves. Brides hire me because I catch the clause that says the caterer keeps the deposit if the date changes. The writer that lets a venue double book a Saturday in peak season. I have a reputation for missing nothing. I believed for 6 years of marriage that the one contract I never needed to read closely was my own. I was wrong, and I would spend the next several weeks proving exactly how wrong, the same methodical way I prove everything else. I met Elliot 7 years ago at a wedding I was coordinating, where he was the best man for a groom I'd worked with twice before. He had an easy, unhurried charm, the kind that made vendors move faster for him without being asked, and I found that magnetic in a way I hadn't expected to. We married a year later in a ceremony I designed down to the last candle, and for a long time I told people, honestly, that marrying inside my own industry meant I knew exactly what I was getting. I gave up very little for that marriage, on paper. Underneath the paper, I gave up the habit of asking questions I already suspected I wouldn't like the answers to. The year-long consulting project in another state that never quite produced a client I could name. The storage unit he paid for in cash and never once mentioned. The way his mother sometimes looked at me with an expression I couldn't place. Something between pity and apology. There was one dinner, maybe 3 years into the marriage, when Rosalind made an offhand comment about how she was just relieved everything got sorted properly the first time. And the table moved past it so quickly I assumed she meant some minor family drama from before I'd arrived. Elliot changed the subject with a joke about his college roommate, and everyone laughed, and I laughed too, because that's what you do at a table with people you love. I did not think about that sentence again for 4 years. When I finally did, I understood it had been the one honest thing said at that entire dinner, and everyone at the table except me had known exactly what it meant. His older brother, Grant, was the person who made our family gatherings feel warm. Grant had been Elliot's best man at our own wedding, the toast giver, the one who remembered my birthday and showed up early to help set up every holiday dinner. I adored him. It would take me weeks to understand that the warmth I loved in Grant and the loyalty he showed his younger brother were not, in the end, separate things. My assistant Priya was the first person I brought into any of it. Not because policy required it, but because I needed a second set of eyes that weren't clouded by 7 years of marriage. I printed the Ash Grove contract, stripped the names, and asked her, professional to professional, what she'd flag on a booking file that looked exactly like this one. She went quiet reading it, then looked up and asked whose file it actually was. I told her. She didn't say anything for a long moment, and then she asked what I needed from her, not whether I was sure, simply what I needed, and I've not forgotten that she asked it exactly that way. 3 days after I found the contract, I understood enough to stop guessing and start building a file. I pulled the Ash Grove Estate's public event calendar and confirmed the date, the guest count, and the vendor list, all publicly listed the way most upscale venues list their bookings for marketing purposes. I called the venue's coordinator under my own business name, framing it as a routine referral inquiry, and learned the wedding had a full 75-person guest list, a live band already contracted, and a bride named Sabine Delacroix, a name I had never once Elliot mentioned in 7 years. I remember sitting with that name for a long moment, testing it the way you test a word in a language you don't speak, trying to decide whether it belonged to someone I should already know. Elliot had built an entire second life detailed enough to include a live band and a 75-person guest list, and not one thread of it had ever touched the life I thought we shared. I remember thinking, oddly, that whoever had designed her centerpieces had genuinely good taste, and then feeling almost ashamed at myself for noticing something so small in the middle of something so large. I have caught myself doing that more than once since, noticing a detail through the lens of my job in a moment my heart clearly wanted to be somewhere else entirely. And I've come to think that's simply what happens when your profession and your instincts have grown into the same organ over enough years. My rule, the same one I use with every difficult client relationship, is that you gather everything before the other party knows you've seen it. People planning a wedding in secret are not careful the way people planning an affair usually are. A wedding needs vendors, deposits, a paper trail loud enough for anyone who knows where to look. I spent a full weekend building what I call, in my own work, the master timeline. The same document I'd hand a client disputing a vendor dispute. Every date and dollar amount laid out until the pattern becomes impossible to argue with. I cross-referenced Elliot's calendar, which he'd shared with me years earlier for scheduling reasons and never thought to revoke against every venue site visit Ashgrove's coordinator confirmed to me. Every visit matched a weekend he had logged to me as work travel. Once you know how to look for the shape of a lie, it stops looking like anything else. The deeper I went, the messier it became. I found catering invoices routed through a shell entity Elliot had registered the same month our own marriage passed its 5th anniversary. I found a florist's public portfolio page featuring Sabine's engagement ring, a ring I recognized instantly because I had been with Elliot when he chose the setting for my own ring 7 years earlier at the same jeweler. What I had assumed in that first sick week was an affair was in fact something with a legal shape I hadn't considered. Elliot was not simply planning to leave me for someone else. He was planning to marry her in front of 75 guests, while, as far as any document I could find showed, still legally married to me. I thought I had found the whole shape of the betrayal until I requested our own marriage license records for an unrelated insurance update and noticed the clerk's note beside Elliot's name. A prior marriage, dissolved, the clerk's file claimed, 4 years before we ever met. I had known about his first marriage in the vaguest terms. He'd described it as a brief, youthful mistake, annulled cleanly before I entered the picture. The county's own annulment index, when I searched it properly, showed no record of a completed annulment at all. Only a filing, opened and never closed. I sat with that discrepancy for 2 full days before I let myself believe it. I have built a career on trusting documents over stories, and yet the first instinct I had, staring at an incomplete annulment filing with my own husband's name on it, was to assume I'd misread it. I hadn't. I called the county clerk's office directly the following morning and asked professionally what it would take to confirm a filing status, and the clerk told me exactly what I already suspected. A filing without a final decree is not a completed dissolution, regardless of how many years have passed since it was opened. I called Elliot's mother, Rosalind, and asked her directly what she knew. She was quiet long enough that I understood the silence itself was an answer, and then she told me the truth she had been carrying alone for 7 years. She had never approved of Elliot's first wife, a young woman she considered beneath the family standing, and when the marriage collapsed within a year, Rosalind had personally paid an attorney to file the paperwork and quietly promised her son it was handled, so he could move forward with his life unencumbered. The attorney, it turned out, had taken her money and never filed the final decree, a detail Rosalind said she only discovered herself 2 years into my own marriage to Elliot and had chosen, out of shame, never to correct. She confirmed it in a signed statement from her own attorney 3 days later, because she said she could no longer be the only person holding the truth that my entire marriage had never been legally valid at all. I asked her why she'd never told me even years later, once the danger of losing Elliot to a bad first choice had long since passed. She said, quietly, that every year that went by made the truth harder to hand over. Not easier, because the longer she waited, the more it would look like exactly what it was. A lie she'd let grow instead of one she'd simply told once. She told me she used to comfort herself by believing Elliot would eventually finish the paperwork himself, formalize it properly once he understood, and that she'd been waiting 7 years for a correction that never came because, in the end, he had no more urgency to fix it than she did. The confrontation happened without me in the room. It happened at Sabine's engagement dinner, hosted at Grant's own home, where my former assistant, Priya, happened to be present coordinating unrelated details for a mutual client. She called me that night and told me what she'd witnessed. Sabine's father, a retired attorney himself, had asked Elliot, casually, whether all his paperwork from his prior marriages was fully in order before the wedding, a standard question for a man his age. Priya said the room went silent in the particular way rooms go silent when everyone senses a question has more weight than it appears to. Elliot's face lost its color. Grant, standing near the bar, set his glass down and did not pick it back up for the rest of the evening. Priya told me the strangest part wasn't the confrontation itself, it was how ordinary the room stayed around it. Servers still moving between tables with past appetizers, a string quartet still working through the same set, while 3 feet from the bar, an entire hidden architecture quietly came apart in front of a room full of people who had no idea what they were witnessing. She said Sabine looked between her father and Elliot for a long moment, visibly recalculating something, and that nobody at that dinner finished dessert. I met Elliot 2 nights later in my own design studio, in the chair I chose and at the hour I chose. He tried to make it small, called it a technicality, said he'd always intended to sort it out quietly before it ever became a problem for anyone. He asked for time, for grace, for the chance to fix what he called a paperwork error. I let him finish. Then I told him that a marriage built on a lie is not a technicality. It is the entire foundation, and that I had spent 9 years telling brides exactly that same thing about contracts far smaller than the one that had defined my own life. I did not raise my voice once. He asked, near the end, whether any of the last 7 years had meant anything to me, and I told him that question assumed we'd been living inside the same set of facts this whole time, and we hadn't, so it didn't have an answer he'd find satisfying. He asked if there was any way to simply fix the old paperwork quietly now and let everything continue as if I'd never found the contract at all. I told him that request answered his own question better than I could, because asking your wife to help you quietly patch a decade-old lie isn't a request for grace, it's a request for a second cover-up. And I had spent 9 years learning to spot exactly that distinction in other people's contracts. He tried a different angle after that, reminding me of the years we'd actually built together. The apartment, the small rituals of an ordinary marriage, as if the sheer volume of shared history could outweigh a filing left permanently open. I told him I hadn't forgotten a single one of those years, and that none of them were actually the thing in question. What was in question was a signature on an annulment form that never became final, and a wedding he'd already booked for a woman who had no idea any of it existed. He went quiet after that, the first real quiet of the whole conversation, the particular quiet of someone realizing the person across from him already knows the ending before he's finished explaining the beginning. I remember noticing, in that silence, how strange it felt to sit across from a man I'd spent 7 years learning every small habit of, and realize I could still read him perfectly, only now through the exact same clinical distance I usually reserve for a stranger's contract dispute. The legal process that followed was not vindictive, because I did not want it to be. My attorney filed for a formal annulment on the grounds of the undissolved prior marriage, a process that moved quickly once Rosalind's statement and the county's own incomplete filing were entered as evidence. I kept my business, entirely untouched by any of it, since it had always operated under my own name. Rosalind offered, more than once, to help mend things between Elliot and me. She called several times over the following months, always gentle, always careful, asking whether there was any version of forgiveness that could still hold the family together the way it had before. I understood by then that her guilt was real and that it wasn't actually mine to manage anymore. I told her some doors closed not from anger, but from the plain fact that they were never legally open to begin with. It has been a year since that Saturday review. I expanded my firm to offer a service I never used to think a wedding planner needed to provide, a legal